light within my heart, light within my thoughts, light within my words. May one and all and everything, blessed and loved, ever be. Welcome. I am Sister Who. As long as there have been capitalistic systems, it seems we have had the phenomena of poverty. And the response has come in all sorts of different forms and ways. What do we do about it? Everything from people who try very hard to ignore it, people who try hard to avoid it. Theologically, there have even been people who try to somehow demonize it, I suppose. That if God loves you, then you won't experience poverty, and if you're experiencing poverty, then you did something wrong. And it's a phenomenon what some people call victim blaming. And I don't know that there is ever complete truth in it, but then again, I'm sure we've all been in situations where we see someone make a wrong choice and a negative result happens. And as much as we don't want to blame the victim, we can see the choice they made that led to a negative outcome, that if they would have just made a different choice at that point. The thing that we have to keep in mind, though, is that they're making the choice that a person at their point of growth would make. So in a sense, the fact that they made a bad choice at that point, whose fault really is it? Is it their fault for making a choice that they were essentially taught and conditioned and trained to make? Or is it society's fault for not having done a better job of education and equipping that person to make a better choice? It kind of reminds me of the line in the movie Ever After, where Danielle is quoting from Utopia and says, "What is to be concluded, sire, except that you first make thieves and then punish them?" In a sense, it's a very real problem within the modern era that we first make people impoverished and then punish them for being in poverty. That because they don't have enough money, they don't get the education, they don't get the house, they don't get the food, they don't get their needs met, they don't get what they need to just be basic, modest, healthy individuals. Too often, I suppose it's because of this ongoing epidemic of narcissism that nobody really seem to want to address. To me, there's an epidemic of narcissism throughout the world. People who want to be concerned only with their own fates, only with their own resources, only with that little piece that they can control, and everything beyond that, well, it's out of my control, I'm not thinking about it. Well, there's something that we need to do as a people, as a community, as a tribe, remembering that humanity is ultimately one big family, just a very extended family, and maybe we don't know all the members in our family personally, but ultimately humanity is one big family. And that's an inescapable reality. We're all interconnected at some level. And consequently, because we're not only interconnected but so interdependent, there are certain challenges that can only be addressed as a community. If it is an activity or a pattern that everybody shares, well, then everybody has to respond to the consequences also. If, for example, a real obvious example, if everyone decides our milk is going to be distributed in plastic jugs, suddenly we have this surplus of plastic jugs. If everyone's going to drive cars, suddenly we have a surplus of worn-out tires. What do we do with the worn-out tires? They have to go somewhere. We can't just wave a magic wand and make them disappear, at least not yet. Perhaps in the world of Star Trek, we will take all of our garbage, all of our worn-out tires, all of our plastic jugs, everything we don't need, and just throw it into this big bin, and where a master computer will magically transform it all into raw energy that can be reconstituted into whatever we need. And so there will be no garbage, because it'll just go from garbage to raw energy to needful product. We're not at that point yet, obviously, because large communities create enormous amounts of garbage and refuse. That's where a lot of recycling programs got started. But of course, for them to work, everybody has to do them. It can't be just one individual doing it on behalf of all the rest. It has to be everybody. In addressing poverty, I come back to this point of it has to be everybody. It has to be understanding that it is not the impoverished individual's fault that they are experiencing what they're experiencing, but understanding how what they are experiencing is the product of a complex societal system and a complex economic system. One of the problems with the economic system is that what the economic system values changes from time to time. In one day and age, in one point in time, at one point in time, real estate in a particular area may be horrendously valuable. 30 years later, for whatever reason, suddenly the real estate isn't valuable anymore. And those who invested their money there will have lost it and not be able to get their money back out of it to reinvest somewhere else. Was it their fault that the economic shifts happened and that they got into it at the wrong point? To be ambivalent about their fate is essentially to look at another member of one's family and say, I don't care about you. Well, the moment you say you don't care about another member of the family, you create the possibility that at some point they will decide they don't care about you. And so because our fates are so interwoven and so interconnected, the only thing that makes sense is unconditional love. From the moment we begin to the moment our lives end, there has to be unconditional love. And even beyond that, for the world to work, there has to be unconditional love. We have to live like we really believe that everyone matters. There have been so many times, even within my own life, but certainly within all of our lives, where what is sometimes called the kindness of strangers. And is it strangers? Well, it's another member of the human family. Not someone I know by name, not someone I expected to meet at this point in time, but someone who showed up just when I needed someone to be there. When my car broke down along the road and I was 10 miles from the nearest town, somebody was willing to stop and give me a ride to the nearest gas station or call a tow truck for me or something. It happens over and over and over again all across the country, all around the world. Because that happens, that's one of our wake-up calls, to say, when you are in need, not always, but a good percentage of the time, perhaps most of the time, somebody will be there. There have been situations where no one was there, and those are tragedies. And in some cases, through heroic efforts, the people survived anyway. In some cases, they didn't. But their death could be used as a wake-up call to the surrounding community to institute some sort of system so that the person could be found in time, so that the tragedy would not be repeated. What makes me a little bit crazy, I guess, with exasperation and frustration, are the times when a problem is identified and the people choose not to deal with it, to turn their backs on it, to think if we just ignore it, if we just don't look at it, that somehow it will magically go away. And what goes away is actually not the problem so much as the relationship to the people affected by the problem. And what we wind up with is a world in which more and more people are cut off from each other, and we cannot do the things collaboratively that need to be done. And the world becomes an increasingly dangerous place with less and less trust and less collaboration, less and less community, and more people experiencing tragedy for what it is. And yet what it is a wake-up call to rediscover each other and to rediscover love and to take hands again and to say, even though I don't know who you are or don't know anything about you, you are a human being and consequently I care about you. We don't seem to have a lot of trouble caring for stray dogs and cats who are abandoned when they're no longer wanted by their families. People will go to extreme lengths to help a dog or a cat that has been hit by a car or has been dumped and is homeless and confused and frightened and needs someone to love it one more time. Well, there are people everywhere around the world who desperately need to be loved one more time, and need to have it demonstrated for them that their lives really matter, and that a person is a person is a person, and every person matters. And that when we go to our churches and synagogues and temples and pray for love and wisdom and good things to happen in our lives, in our world, in our governments, that it doesn't just stop with throwing a note at heaven's door and walking away, but that we're willing to be involved in a sense that we're willing to be God's hands in making that solution manifest in our communities. There's a common expression that always kind of irritates me because it goes back to the same sort of disconnection, that it's about choosing not to love and choosing to maintain distance. But the more distance you have, the fewer resources you have, because it's by minimizing the distance between each other, minimizing the distance between human hearts, that you create more collaboration and more ability to respond to problems. The expression, not in my backyard. Yes, we want to help the alcoholic, yes, we want to help the drug addict, yes, we want to help people in poverty, but we don't want them to be anywhere close to us. We want the problems to somehow be somewhere else. The problem, of course, is that if that problem ever happens to us directly, if through a medical crisis and paying high medical bills, suddenly all your funds are exhausted and you become the one who is impoverished because the medical industry took it all, the pharmaceutical company took it all, there's nothing left to spend. You become the one who's impoverished, and by the pattern that you used to practice, that you formerly practiced, you now become the one who is held at arm's length and is not helped, because everybody treats poverty like it was some sort of contagious illness, that if it was too close to me, I might catch it somehow. If poverty is spreading, to me, it is the wake-up call that society needs to address its systems and create new and better systems. It is an indication, it is a blinking light, it is an indication of the greatest proportions, a flashing light, a pointing arrow, something that makes it absolutely clear what is wrong and what needs to be addressed. And if we simply say, well, I'll take another road and not look at that one, eventually we're going to run out of roads, and there won't be anybody to help us because they're all stuck on all the roads that we ignored, when all of those could have been resolved if we had simply addressed them together instead of narcissistically shoving it off as if it were somebody else's problem. The thing that bothers me even more, I think, and in a way this kind of reminds me of Charles Dickens' book, The Christmas Carol, of Ebenezer Scrooge, talking about, are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? And yet having no idea at all what the workhouses and prisons are like, or what the poorhouses are like. That as much as he wants to say that is society's answer to the problem, he didn't take the time to find out whether it was an effective answer, whether the poorhouses and prisons and workhouses were in fact effectively dealing with the problem of poverty and unemployment and homelessness, or whether all of those programs were somehow being mismanaged in such a way that they weren't accomplishing their goals at all. That instead of giving people a way to survive a season of poverty and to recover from it, they're instead entrenching people in that poverty and unofficially turning them into the next slave class. Slavery didn't end in the mid-19th century in the United States. It goes on. It has just taken on new forms, to the extent that our values and our ability to not see or look beyond or ignore the humanity in each other persists. We indirectly, perhaps unintentionally, but nonetheless, make slaves of each other. there needs to be a societal response in keeping with our creeds, so that by our lack of response to poverty, we aren't making ourselves all into hypocrites. When we say every person matters, every person except the poor person who shows up at my church, we don't want them in the church until they're dressed appropriately. There was one church that actually told me not to become a member until I could make regular, significant financial contributions to the Sunday collection plate. They wanted to know that I was going to financially support them before I would be welcome as a member in that church. I find that outrageous. I do understand that there are expenses to running a church, that there is a building to maintain, that there are bulletins that are handed out each Sunday, that there is an electric bill to pay, and so forth. I think there are enough intelligent adults in a church that they could find a way to meet those needs without excluding other people who really need the community and the love and the wisdom that would otherwise be available there. Instead of being excluded because I'm too poor, to be included because I'm creative, to be included because I'm intelligent, to be included because I have an education, to be included because I'm willing to work, to be included because I'm willing to love anyone who comes through the door, that I don't have discriminatory criteria by which, when I go to church, I decide that, well, I will go to a restaurant after church with you, but not with you. Or I will help you carry your things to your car, but I won't help you. Or I will listen to this person's complaint, but not that person's. I don't want to hear about alcoholism, but I'm perfectly comfortable with listening to stories of drug addiction. A person is a person is a person. It's not the problem, it's not the identity of the person or the identity of the problem or the identity of the helper that is important. It's the dynamic of love that addresses whatever needs to be addressed, that says, I am willing to be involved. I'm going to try to be involved in intelligent ways that are genuinely effective, but I am willing to be involved. There are certain things that no matter how much you love someone, you can't do for them. One of the early witticisms I coined is that whoever wants the muscles has to lift the weights. You can provide the perfect gym, you can cheer them on, you can do all sorts of things, but for your friend or loved one or the stranger that you just met to develop muscles, they have to be the one to lift the weights. If they can turn around and say, however, I'm living in poverty, I don't have access to a gym, I don't have access to the weights, I don't have anyone to encourage me, I don't have anyone who cares about me enough to see if I'm sleeping outside at night or if I'm eating a healthy meal every day. If they can say that and society has no answer but, gee, you're right, you don't have anyone, that's an indictment of society, of the community, of the tribe. It comes back to the basic, but it reminds me of the parable that Jesus told in the Bible in the New Testament about the final judgment, where on one side are the sheep and on the other side are the goats. And the sheep are the ones who get to go to heaven, and the goats are the ones that are cast into outer darkness. Just the way the parable is told, not that there's anything right or wrong about being a particular sheep or a goat. My apologies to anybody who fancies one animal or the other. It's just the way the parable was told. But the thing that divided them was just when Jesus said, because you were the ones of which it could be said, when I was hungry, you fed me. When I was thirsty, you gave me to drink. When I was homeless, you gave me shelter. When I was naked, you gave me clothing. And on the other side, it's not about what their theology was, whether they were a nice person, whether they dressed appropriately, what kind of car they drove. It was about what they did and didn't do. I was hungry and you gave me nothing. I was homeless and you didn't care. You shut your door in my face. I I was thirsty and you didn't give me anything to drink. I was in need and you turned away and did absolutely nothing. If you weren't able to do something, I suppose logic would say that's something to consider. But it seems to me that in most cases there is something we can do. No, I can't write a check to buy you a new house. Well, I realize I'm rambling somewhat here, but I hope you're seeing the common thread that it's about personal involvement. The story that popped into my head as I was trying to think of a good way to illustrate that, because my mind thinks in pictures, and I'm getting literally hundreds of pictures flashing through my head at the moment as I'm trying to decide which one will most effectively tell the story and what words to assign to it. I recollect a time when a couple of friends and I put on a little performance at Christmas time when we were in college, trying to convey to people the heart of the Christmas message, the Nativity, that what does it really, really mean? And there was an anecdote, I don't know if it was a real story that happened somewhere in the past or not, but it was a church that wanted to put on their Christmas play showing the story of the Nativity, the Christian biblical Nativity one more time, that of Joseph and Mary being called to this town because there's supposed to be this census and they have to go pay a tax, and they get there and all the motels are filled, there's no place to stay, and they knock on the last door and the innkeeper says, well, there's room in the stable if you want to go sleep in my barn, basically. Of course, in modern times there would be the town clerk right behind him saying, you don't have an occupancy permit for that stable. At that time, thankfully, they didn't have to worry about that. So they got to go stay in the stable, and that was where, according to the story, Jesus was born. Well, this church, in this anecdote I read, was wanting to remind everybody of that and put on a performance. And there was one particular learning disabled adult in the congregation who wanted very much to be part of the play, but was always excluded because of his mental limitations. Well, they finally decided that they would give him the role of the innkeeper, and all he had to say is, there's no room, go away. There's no room, go away. There's no room, go away. You can sleep in the stable. That's all he had to say. But as he was feeling the meaning of the story and the love that was necessary to address that experience of poverty, he found he couldn't say the line. And someone was prompting him from the edge of the stage saying, there's no room, go away. There's no room, go away. And he looked at the two portraying Mary and Joseph, having traveled this long ways, tired, and Mary's about to give birth to a child, and they keep telling him to say to them, there's no room, go away. And he finally looks at them and says, you can have my room. And perhaps that was the first time that that congregation really understood, if they were listening, what the story is all about. That at some point, if love is real, and if there is any integrity whatsoever to your faith, it comes down to saying, it comes down to acts of self-sacrifice, of saying, I'll be okay, you take what I have, you need it more than I do. When we get to the point that we love each other that much, obviously the world will be a very, very different place. And I think that is when we will finally see an end to poverty. Because ultimately what poverty is telling us is that somebody didn't love enough, that there wasn't enough love to go around, that there wasn't enough integrity in all the faith in the local community. If for all the churches you see in every town, if there are that many churches, there shouldn't be any poverty within 100 miles. That's an indictment of Christians, of people of faith of every description, of pagans, Muslims, Jews, whatever spiritual path or none. If there's a an impoverished person anywhere within 100 miles of you, and you have more than you need, don't try to tell me that your faith is real. If you don't believe it enough to do it, you don't really believe it at all. I'm not the world's best expert on economics or politics or anything like that. I'm a person who cares. And if all I can do is encourage the dialogue and encourage awareness, encourage people to finally see each other and not see just a label, just a category, just the impoverished person, but to instead see John or Mary or Susan or David or Christopher or whatever the person's name is, and to respond with love, even if you only have a little to give, even if all you have is a stable, to say, it's yours, it's all I've got, but it's yours. I can't stand here as a person of faith and do nothing. I have to do something. This I can do. I hope I've given you some good things to think about in the last half hour. Thank you very much for watching.